Hi everyone, you are on the channel BL Story of Love, the channel with forbidden BL stories you just cannot stop listening to. Do not forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription, so you will not miss new forbidden BL stories. And now, let us slowly go back to the place where 8 years of someone else's life turned a marriage contract into a cage. Elias remembered the day his world was neatly cut along the seam and handed over to someone else. He was about 20, had just graduated from university with an excellent economics degree, wore glasses that were a little too thin, and honestly believed his ceiling was a job in the Hart Holdings analytics department. A quiet office, spreadsheets, reports, and a small book club in the evenings. The family council decided otherwise. For the Hart clan, he was not a person, but a beautiful line in a long strategy. An omega with a proper education, a convenient temperament, and genetics that matched perfectly with the Cain line. On the day of negotiations, they sat him at a long, dark wooden table that looked more like a judge's bench than a place to discuss a future family. On one side sat his father and uncle, smelling of expensive alcohol and perfume, with a bitter, nervous note over it. On the other side were the Cain representatives, men with the same polished smiles, used to raising and crashing media markets with a single call. Elias felt like an extra in a play where the script was already finished. The only words that were addressed to him personally were short and cold. Just sign. Adrian Cain entered the room last like a man who could afford to be late. Tall, put together, in a perfectly tailored suit, he moved with that lazy confidence only alphas have, the ones who grow up hearing that the world belongs to them. His gaze slid quickly over the faces of the Harts, stopped on Elias for half a second, and the corner of his mouth twitched, not from dislike, not from interest, from boredom. Another deal. Another alliance to be worked off for the clan. The wedding went exactly the way most contract ceremonies go between old families. White marble. Florists booked months in advance. Musicians playing just loud enough to cover awkward pauses. In the photos, everything looked almost romantic. A tall alpha with the Cain name, a slender omega with the Hart name, a gentle tilt of the head, hands meeting at the perfect moment for the cameras. But on those photos, Elias saw only one thing: the empty look in Adrian's eyes, the slightly tense jaw, disgust carefully wrapped in politeness. The first months of their life together were not a parade after the celebration, but a cold quarantine. Their new penthouse in the city center was designed like a perfect showcase: floor-to-ceiling windows, a fireplace, glass partitions, fashionable neutral paintings. On paper, it was supposed to be a nest for a young couple. In reality, the space split into invisible zones of influence. Adrian had his own office, his own gym, his own bathroom, his own evenings. Elias had the guest bedroom, where his books, laptop, and a few things from his former life slowly migrated. Physical closeness in their marriage was not about wanting. It was about schedule. Reproductive specialists drew tidy tables, doctors wrote recommendations, the older Harts called and politely asked how things were going with the heir. On the days when hormones and obligations lined up, Adrian came into Elias's room, smelling of expensive cologne and fatigue, and everything happened quickly, with almost no words. It felt more like a medical checkup than intimacy. Sometimes, turning his face to the wall, Elias caught a terrifying thought. It would almost be easier if he felt roughness, anger, at least some emotion from this alpha. Indifference was worse than anything. The hatred did not appear in one day. At first, it was just discomfort, like new shoes that rub, but technically are your size. Then came chronic exhaustion, when every public appearance turned into a performance, and every dinner into a report about the day. Adrian knew how to talk to journalists, shareholders, and rivals. With Elias, he almost did not talk at all. Sometimes, passing by, he would drop a short, icy line like, "Do not dramatize," and leave, sure that this was enough to close any topic. To the outside world, they were a perfect picture. Magazines loved headlines about the union of two media dynasties. Paparazzi caught them leaving charity balls and awards. In public, Adrian could lightly touch his omega's elbow, lean in as if to whisper something, and cameras would catch that moment as proof of great love. On the way home, in the car, there were always a few centimeters of empty air between them, thick with unsaid words. Elias slowly learned how to disappear. In rooms where alphas gathered, he turned into background. He poured drinks for guests, smiled when people looked at him, and slipped into the corner as soon as the conversation switched to numbers and strategy. His analytical skills were used for reports, but his name was rarely mentioned. They sent him to meetings as a representative of the family, but almost never gave him the floor. He became the perfect shadow, functional, convenient, and not demanding attention. The tiny cuts added up. One time he overheard Adrian on the phone, thinking Elias was out of earshot, call their marriage a necessary compromise. Another time, at a dinner with partners, one of the older Canes laughed and said that at least Elias does not get in the way. A third time, at a charity auction, some alpha made a crude joke while looking at Elias like he was an object. Adrian said nothing. Not in that moment, not later. He did not defend him, did not even bring it up. He simply pretended not to notice. For Elias, that was a sentence. You are not important enough for me to start a conflict because of you. By the 4th or 5th year of their union, the cold between them became almost physical. Each of them developed their own way of hitting without raising a hand. Adrian buried himself in work. For weeks he could live only inside schedules, meetings, and flights, coming back to the penthouse just to change clothes and show up at the next public event. Elias reacted differently. He stopped sharing even small things, became so polite it turned into ice. His answers turned short. He stopped asking questions, stopped asking for help. Sometimes his passive resistance came in little acts. Forgetting a tie before an important meeting, not forwarding a document on time, leaving a comment on a report that was too honest. Always just on the safe side of acceptable, without open sabotage, but enough to irritate. At night, when the city outside the windows turned into an ocean of light, Elias lay awake in his room and counted years. His life had a before the Canes and an after the contract. Before smelled of lecture halls, vending machine coffee, loud friends and dreams about an internship abroad. After smelled of polished wood, Adrian's cologne, cold sheets and endless social events where every glance was an evaluation. The 8th year of their marriage did not bring anything new. It brought an odd emptiness. Arguments dried up. Their energy to fight also burned out. They lived in parallel, like two lines that would never meet. Sometimes Elias caught himself on the thought that he no longer imagined his old age. Not just old age with Adrian, old age in general. The future became flat, like a secretary's calendar, meeting, event, report, reception, another joint appearance where his hand rested on the alpha's hand, exactly as long as photographers needed. Sometimes catching the stray scent of another alpha in the hallway, a bodyguard, a courier, a business partner, he thought bitterly. It would be easier if Adrian openly cheated. Easier if there were scenes, shouting, broken glasses, clear words like, I do not need you. You can push away from honest hatred. There is nowhere to push off from polite indifference. And still, under the exhaustion and built-up anger, there was a very thin layer he was afraid to touch, even in his own thoughts. In the early years, when the contract had just started, he still believed he would get used to it. That one day he would see in Adrian's eyes not only boredom and irritation, but also that simple human warmth people write about in romance novels. That the smell of their home would stop being a mix of furniture polish and tension and turn into something like safety. With time, that hope did not disappear completely, but became so thin it looked like a crack in glass, invisible from the outside, dangerous from the inside. As long as both of them pretended not to see it, the cage around their shared life stayed whole, not golden anymore, just tight. That chapter of their story did not end with a loud scandal. It burned out quietly. They still wore the same rings, shared the same last name, appeared in the same photos. But in reality, for 8 long years they shared one cage, each standing on their own side of the bars. And no one yet knew that this fake balance would soon collapse because of one decision that seemed like it should bring freedom to both of them. Ryan Lawson did not appear in their life as a lover. He first showed up as a line in a presentation, a beta with a flawless reputation in the music industry, a portfolio full of artists he had pulled out of the mud, and that easy charm that makes investors forget their questions. At first, his name sounded dry in reports: consultant, development partner, potential co-founder of a new division. The first time Elias saw him was at yet another charity event where Hart and Kane had to play the perfect married couple again. Adrian in a strict dark suit, Elias in a lighter one, matched too carefully to the evening's neutral palette. Camera flashes, champagne. The same speeches about social responsibility. Ryan walked into the hall like someone used to being the center of attention without even trying. Not very tall, with slightly messy hair that did not fit the dress code, with an open smile and a soft but sharp gaze. He talked as if he was really listening to the answers and laughed too loudly for that cold hall. Within 10 minutes, there was already a small circle around him, people who always reach for the one live flame in a room full of ice. Elias noticed something else. When Ryan came up to greet them, Adrian's body language changed. The shoulders that were usually tense dropped just a little. His voice gained a warm, low note that Elias had never heard in their rare domestic conversations. His gaze lingered longer than etiquette required. Elias had seen this before on other alphas, on the faces of men who talked about a strategic partner, but meant not just business. From that evening, Ryan's name sounded in their house more and more often. At first as neutral updates, dinner with Lawson, a meeting at the studio, talks about licensing. Then as a constant background, notifications popping up on the phone screen. Late-night calls that Adrian took in his office, closing the door a bit softer than usual. His scent more and more often brought into the house traces of someone else's cologne, mixed with that light adrenaline buzz from a successful day. At the beginning, Elias tried to write it all off as work. The music direction was not just a toy for the Canes. It was a serious investment. Of course, the heir spent a lot of time there. Of course, he built trust with the main beta producer. It was all logical. Until you start noticing how the man who was always sharp and rigid next to you turned softer next to someone else. He saw it in the rare joint evenings when Ryan came to their home. The beta brought noise with him, laughter, the smell of coffee in the street, stories with more emotion than numbers. Adrian listened, leaning forward a bit, with the kind of attention Elias had never felt on himself. Sometimes they argued about an album concept or about which artist to sign, and there was more life in those arguments than in all of Elias's conversations with his husband over the past years. He felt Ryan's polite, passing interest directed at him, the way you look at a nice but irrelevant decorative object. "Here is my spouse," is what the glance said, and then the focus went back to the real topic. Elias again became part of the background you simply get used to. He is here. He is polite. He does not interfere. A convenient shadow. The center of gravity in the house shifted. Shared dinners grew fewer. At first because of busy schedules, later with no explanation at all. Adrian started staying out in the city more, coming home deep in the night when the penthouse was already soaked in its usual heavy silence. Sometimes Elias woke because he heard the lock click, the fabric of an expensive coat rustle in the hall, and water run in the bathroom, the sounds of a tired man. But under them there was something else, that tiny, almost inaudible note of pleasure you bring back from an evening that actually felt good. Sometimes, even after Ryan left, a light echo of his laughter seemed to hang in the air, as if he had just been here, in the kitchen, in the living room, in their shared space, and the legal owner of this space had nothing to do with it. The hatred Elias had been directing at one point, at one man, started to split. Adrian still angered him with his coldness, control, his refusal to see him as a real person. But a second direction appeared, inward. A quiet, poisonous hatred of himself for being capable of jealousy at all. Jealous of who? A beta who was giving the man who had never wanted Elias exactly what Elias had never gotten. Jealous of his own emptiness, which looked even more humiliating next to someone else's brightness. He began staying longer at the office, took on extra tasks, stepped into projects he did not have to touch. Hours in a glass tower among spreadsheets and presentations were easier than minutes in the penthouse that smelled of someone else's laughter. Secretaries got used to him being the last to leave. His father called it finally taking the business seriously. No one saw that this was not ambition. It was escape. The physical distance between them became as real as the emotional one. Evenings when they ended up in the same room could be counted on one hand. They sat at opposite ends of the sofa, each with his own screen, laptop, phone, reports. Sometimes a whole evening went by without a single word except a formal good night. Each week that good night got shorter, almost soundless. People outside started whispering about the three of them much earlier than anyone dared to say anything inside. In their industry, rumors ran faster than contracts. Journalists wrote about the brilliant tandem of Kane and Lawson. Bloggers breathlessly discussed their chemistry on stage and backstage. Society columns gently dropped phrases like the air's heartbeats in the rhythm of new music. For the Predator families, it was just wordplay. For Elias, it was a punch. He read those lines in the smoking area at work, in the car, alone, his eyes clinging to every sentence. Where the writers painted true love that came too late, he wanted to laugh. Bitterly, silently. Too late for whom exactly? For the Alpha who from the very beginning treated their marriage like a deal? For the Omega who spent 8 years trying to believe that cold can be warmed up with patience? Or for the fact that someone finally saw Adrian as a person and not a last name? But that someone had nothing to do with him? At some point the topic of true love almost became fashionable in their circle. At dinners where they were invited as a couple, friends and partners liked to discuss how not everyone is lucky enough to meet their true heart right away, and how sometimes fate sends you the right person when you already have obligations. Those phrases were said with a sympathetic smile addressed to Adrian, not to him. Elias sat nearby in his perfect shirt, sipped wine in tiny sips, and thought only one thing. Of course, true love. It always shows up exactly when you have zero control left. The strange thing was that the clearer the connection between Adrian and Ryan became, the fewer open fights there were. No scenes of jealousy, no thrown objects, no slammed doors, no one caught anyone cheating. There was nothing in their life that could really be called loyalty. This was not a classic story of betrayal. It was a quiet drift. Adrian disappeared into his real life somewhere outside their contract. Elias stepped further and further into the shadows without even trying to stop him. And still, every new flash of softness, every too warm look he caught in a reflection in the studio's glass wall, cut him inside like a thin blade. Not because he claimed that warmth for himself, but because now he knew the Alpha he had spent 8 years thinking of as stone was actually capable of being alive. Just not with him. One evening, coming home after another late shift, he stopped in the hallway without turning on the light. From the living room, he heard voices. Quiet, relaxed. Ryan was still there. They talked about releases, a tour, some musician who had missed deadlines again. The work talk slid into laughter, then into a soft pause, then into a quiet sigh that carried far too much inside it. Elias stood in the shadows and, for the first time, clearly understood. This house now had a heart. It simply did not belong to him. Something clicked inside. The hatred for Adrian that he had built for years turned from a dull rock into a sharp, almost transparent plate. The hatred for himself, for letting his life get to the point where he was just watching it from the side, grew heavier. He suddenly saw it clearly. There were 2 of them, alive and real, who had chosen each other, and he was the third. A formality, a signature on a piece of paper. A bag of bones and obligations standing between them. That night he fell asleep in the guest room without undressing, his laptop still open on spreadsheets. Instead of numbers, his mind pulsed with one thought. This story was heading toward an ending, and maybe the only way to survive was to be the one who cut the paper they had tied his life with 8 years ago. The question of divorce did not come out of pain or sudden clarity. It was carried into the room by a man in a perfectly pressed suit, with a neat folder and a voice that held not a trace of emotion. For the legal departments of Kane and Hart, this was not drama. It was a technical necessity, another structure that needed to be cleaned of extra ties so the new project with Ryan Lawson would look flawless for investors. The meeting room was cold, even though the air conditioning had been turned off at the start. The glass walls reflected the 3 of them, Adrian at the head of the table, Elias to the side, and the lawyer reading out clauses without lifting his eyes. When the phrase, "the current marriage contract no longer serves the interests of the parties," came, it sounded as routine as, "the lease is ending." The lawyer used the word divorce only once, carefully, as if testing its weight. For him, it was legal language. For Elias, it was a sound that sliced through the usual background of numbers and last names. He looked at Adrian and saw his fingers tighten just a bit, his tired face flicker for a second. Somewhere between relief and fear, something really did tremble. The lawyer talked about risks, shared assets, how the presence of the Hart clan in the paperwork blocked a future deal involving the new label and Ryan's projects. He explained that rewriting the marriage contract would let them structure relationships more flexibly. There was not a single word about a person who had spent 8 years waking up and falling asleep next to another person. Only percentages, shares, and ways to protect everyone from scandals. Elias sat with a perfect neutral expression and realized, suddenly, that for the first time they saw him not as a weak spot to hold on to, but as an extra line to remove. That made it easier and humiliating at the same time, as if his invisibility had finally been taken to its logical end. That night, the penthouse breathed differently. The air smelled of alcohol, glass, and things unsaid. Adrian stood at the huge window with a glass he barely drank from, looking down at the city lights. When Elias stepped into the living room, he felt the tension even before he heard his voice. Adrian did not put on a scene. He did not shout, blame, or justify himself. He simply said, without turning his head, in a low voice, "We need to get divorced." The phrase hung between them like a sentence already signed. No drama, no request, no room to pretend it was just an idea. Then came a few more dry lines clearly borrowed from the lawyers. That neither of us is happy in this bond. That we tried, but it turned out the way it did. That the right thing would be to free each other. On some level, Elias heard the honesty in that. Yes, both of them were unhappy. Yes, 8 years of compromise and silent war had not made anyone better. And yet a part of him that was still clinging to the simple fact of being tied to someone twisted painfully. Not because he wanted to save the marriage, because they were only letting him go now when one man's freedom had become a condition for someone else's happiness. His lips shaped a quiet, "So, divorce." He did not ask why. The answer was in every scent, every message, every look Adrian gave his phone when Ryan's name popped up there. Freedom suddenly had a concrete face, and the price of that freedom became clear. He had to leave in a way that did not destroy someone else's true love. The discussion of terms turned into another carefully scheduled deal. In a separate room, with his own lawyer this time, they laid out everything that made up their life together. The penthouse, investments, joint projects, shares and funds. For the first time, Elias saw himself in documents not in the spouse line, but as a party entitled to a particular exit package. He was asked for very little. Give up the Kane last name and either return to Hart or choose a neutral one. Sign non-disclosure agreements that clearly said, no public comments on the family's internal affairs, no interviews about Ryan, no hints that the marriage had been anything more or less than a mutual choice. In exchange, he would get a payout big enough for a fresh start in any country, enough for his own place, enough to not think about work for years. The lawyer representing him spoke with calm confidence, urged him to negotiate harder, reminded him that 8 years of his life were worth something, that he should not sign the first offer. He laid out where Elias could invest the money to secure stability. Listening to him, Elias suddenly realized that they were discussing him in exactly the same way they used to discuss any other asset at family councils. Meetings with the Hart clan were not easier. His father saw the divorce as the right strategy. The Kane heir had effectively left the game anyway by emotionally attaching himself to a beta. His mother talked about reputation and how they needed to exit this with dignity and not make scenes. No one asked him what he really wanted. They were interested in consequences for the name. On paper, the price of freedom looked neat. A few pages, each with clauses, subclauses, and references to laws. One line had a sum that would buy a house by the sea, a small studio in a big city, and leave enough to not worry about salary for a long time. Another line described the terms for keeping small stakes in projects where his role had been real, not symbolic. Dry paragraphs where 8 years shrank into a couple of sentences about compensation and closed accounts. The real price hid in other lines, the kind most people would skip. In the section on personal status was a note about formal pair rejection. The Omega was offered a medical procedure to officially break the remaining hormonal and social bonds. A medical commission, tests, a few injections. Afterwards, his body would stop reacting to the alpha the way it was used to. Elias read those lines and felt a thin, sticky panic rise inside. They had never been true mates. Their connection rested on a contract and expectations. But 8 years is enough for a body to learn a person's footsteps, scent, intonations. Formal rejection meant not just legal, but physical erasing. "We will wipe you out of each other," that clause really said. And still he knew, without this, his freedom would always be conditional. As long as the system marked a bond, any new life would forever bump into the old one. Any attempt to choose someone else would hit old records. He could refuse the procedure, hang in between, half in the cage, half in the hallway. The strangest line was the one his lawyer read out loud after a small pause. In the section about public image, between phrases about avoiding scandals, was a soft recommendation. If the parties wished, Omega Heart could attend the official ceremony of the heir's new union to emphasize that there was no conflict. The former spouse as a symbol of civility. This hit harder than the numbers. They were asking him not only to let the alpha go legally and physically, but to stand in as decoration at his new wedding. A live sign saying, "Everything is fine. No one owes anyone anything." A sweet, convenient image, the X in the first row, smiling while the alpha makes vows to someone else. The lawyer carefully pointed out that this clause was not mandatory, but desirable. Easier for the press, calmer for investors, smoother landing for both families. Elias listened and thought only one thing. Freedom is expensive. Sometimes it demands that you stand in someone else's church and pretend you are happy. At night, he kept returning to these papers in his head, reread the phrases he already knew by heart, imagined what kind of life he could build on the money offered. A small apartment where nobody waits for his cent, work not tied to a last name, a city where no one knows him. All of that looked tempting until he remembered where he would have to start. From the day his documents stopped saying Cain, and at the altar next to Adrian there would be someone else. At some point he noticed that he was not bargaining. Not for sums, not for conditions. Where another person would squeeze every line in their favor, he almost automatically agreed. Not because he did not understand the value, because he was tired. Freedom, even paid for with money, a last name and a role in someone else's show, was still freedom. And he was ready to pay, as long as he would not wake up in that penthouse anymore, breathing air that belonged to other people. The day they brought him the final version of the documents was gray. The city outside the Hart office windows was just rows of towers. In the meeting room, where they left him alone with the papers, it was quiet. On the table lay the printed copies, each with a blank space for his name. His hand shook when he picked up the pen. As a child, his father taught him that a signature is power, a sign that you decide. In their world, signatures under contracts often turn people into hostages of their own choices. Now it was the opposite. His name was supposed to be the knife cutting through 8 years of knots. He signed the divorce papers, then the non-disclosure agreements, then the forms for the medical commission, which would officially record the rejection of the pair. The lines blurred, but each stroke cut inside. On the bottom of the stack was the page with the clause about attending the future wedding. Next to it, a neat, "at the party's discretion." He thought he could cross it out, refuse, push it away. Instead, he just exhaled softly and left it as it was. Freedom looked exactly like this. Not like a heroic escape or a dramatic door slam, but like a pile of stamps and a few lines of his name at the bottom of each page. Like agreeing to play the role of a civilized ex so the world would let him leave without dragging him through more dirt. When he stepped out of the meeting room, the corridor felt too long. His chest was empty, but light. as if he had finally paid an enormous bill that had been growing for years and now only had to wait for the change. The day when the name Cain would disappear from his documents and another person would stand next to Adrian at the altar. Only later would he understand that the real price of freedom was not the numbers or the name. The real price was to stand there and watch the Alpha you had hated for 8 years and let go, stand with someone he loved and still have the courage not to look away. But that day was still ahead. For now he had just taken the first quietest step out of the cage he had lived in for almost a decade. The day they drove to the legal center looked deceptively ordinary. No storm, no symbolic rain. Just a gray sky, dry air, and the usual city noise. The car from the escort service followed the familiar route and only at the end turned not to the Kane office and not to their home, but to a glass and steel complex where, for wealthy clients, they handled marriages, divorces, adoptions, and all the other things that get called family law when there is money involved. Inside, it smelled of coffee, fresh paper, and something sterile, almost medical. People at the reception smiled the same polite smile at everyone and never held their gaze for long. Here, no one was interested in stories. They cared about correct data and full payment. Elias walked down the hallway next to the Kane legal representative and thought about how all the important events in his life always happened in rooms with good soundproofing. The meeting room where they had married him to Adrian. The office where they discussed the divorce. Now this legal center where they were supposed to put a final dot. Panels, glass, soft voices, filtered emotions. They were shown into a separate room with an oval table. On the wall hung a bland abstract print. On the table stood a water carafe, pen stands, and a few stacks of documents. The manager spoke softly, almost reassuringly, like staff in an expensive clinic. The procedure was simple, well practiced. It would not take much time. Specialists had prepared everything in advance. There was no judgment in his voice, no sympathy, just professional emptiness. They put a folder of documents in front of Elias. On top was the form for giving up the marital bond in the pair. Below were the forms for changing his last name, notices for state registries, updates for medical databases. Every page was constructed so that there would be no rough edges, no loose ends, no untracked step. He picked up the first sheet. At the top was his full name, still with the surname Kane, and his status, an Omega who had been in a registered union with the heir of the house. Below ran neat lines of text, voluntarily gives up pair status, understands the consequences, has no material or other claims, agrees to update all records in connection with the change of status. He read and felt a strange split inside. These phrases gave no hint of what stood behind them. The paper did not know how many nights he had lain on the very edge of the bed, feeling the mattress dip when Adrian came home late and lay down without moving any closer than a safe 40 centimeters. The paper did not know how he had sat on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m, listening to the Alpha in the next room laugh into the phone in a different living voice. It did not know how he had spent years pretending he did not care. In the document, all of that was reduced to one line. Cohabitation did not work out. The manager politely pointed at the signature field, explained where to put the date, where to sign with initials, and where with his full name. For him, this was just another workday, another client, another contract, another stamp to be pushed into the register. That impersonality was almost comforting. Their story no longer mattered to anyone but the two of them. Next lay a sheet that concerned not only the marriage, but his biology. Official consent to the procedure confirming the break of the pair bond. On paper it was needed so that medical systems would stop showing their link so that future partnerships would not run into old records. In reality, it looked like a very cold text, confirms the absence of intent to maintain hormonal, social, and emotional connection with the Alpha, followed by a long list of rights he agreed to waive. Elias's eyes stopped on the phrase, absence of intent to maintain, as if everything they had gone through had been intent, as if 8 years of exhaustion etched into his body could dissolve just because he signed a paper, and a few injections slightly adjusted his reaction to assent. It is just standard wording, the manager explained calmly when he saw Elias freeze. It is there to make sure you do not run into trouble with future marriage contracts. Future marriage contracts echoed in his head. The thought that somewhere ahead there might be another glass meeting room and another alpha tapping nervous fingers on a table felt so distant and absurd that he simply nodded. In the next folder lay the application to change his surname. His birth name, Hart, was printed in neat black letters like a neutral safe harbor. Kane stood next to it in brackets as an obsolete option. Even visually, it looked like they had simply decided to reformat one version of his life. When he picked up the pen, his fingers suddenly trembled. A short sign sounded in his memory in his father's voice, the man who had always taught him not to be afraid of decisions. Here, it was different. This signature was not opening a door to a new deal, it was erasing the trace of an old one. He signed the pair rejection form first, cleanly, without his hand shaking, drawing every letter of his name. The moment the ink soaked into the paper, something did jerk inside. Not loudly, not dramatically, more like a thin thread that had been pulled tight for a very long time and finally snapped. The most symbolic line was the block where he had to sign under "has no claims against the alpha with whom he was in union." There was more lying in that one sentence than in all their society interviews put together, and still he signed, not for truth, for freedom. Then came the surname change application. His hand slowed a little when he wrote Hart. It felt strange, like he was not going back to his old self, but to a ghost. In the years with the Kane name, he had gotten used to people seeing him through its weight. Doors opened, voices dropped, someone automatically treated him as privileged. Now those reactions would fade, and he himself would become lighter. Last was a form for the state registries, where his status and surname would be updated along with dozens of invisible traces, records in tax databases, medical archives, banking systems. One line sounded especially dry. Information about the marriage is kept in the archive, status changes registered. An entire era shrank into that sterile phrase. When he put down the pen, the manager checked every page, stacked the documents, kept part of them, and handed the rest back in a temporary packet, a set of papers that would be valid while the system updated his data. In a few weeks, the portals of government services would show an Elias Hart who was not in any active union with the Kane heir. The records would still exist, but buried deep in the archives. For most people, he would be a clean figure. As he was leaving the legal center, he caught his reflection in the glass door. Same face, same body, same habit of holding his shoulders a bit tense, no visible sign that a large part of his social identity had just been erased. He suddenly wanted to do something physically tangible, rip off his ring, tear off his tie, cut a card with the Kane name on it, but everything had already been done in ink. Outside it was loud, cars, voices, notification sounds. In that city noise, there was surprisingly little space for his private silence. He sat down in the car, put the folder with documents on his knees, and finally let himself close his eyes. The feeling of emptiness rolled over him almost at once. Not the light, promised freedom from the lawyer's pitch, but a heavy, sticky absence. For 8 years, his world had been built around one point, an alpha he had both despised and feared. All his routes, schedules, and internal codes had been tuned to that man's steps and scent. Now that point had formally disappeared. The system had lost its center of gravity. It would take time before a new one appeared. He read his name on the new temporary ID at home. The document, issued in urgent mode, looked comically official. Hart stood in a straight line, as if it had always been his surname. No tags, no footnotes about a former status. Looking at it, he suddenly realized he felt even more hollow than before he went into that office. He had thought that today he would feel almost physical relief, that the weight would slide off his shoulders and he would breathe freely. That relief would come, but later. For now a thin, stubborn thread still stretched across his chest, not to a surname, not to a house, but to the simple fact that somewhere in this city walked an alpha whose name had just been officially cut away from his. And that bond, on the level of instinct and memory, did not obey any wording. On the way to his new apartment, he noticed one more detail that was, maybe, more important than the papers themselves. Nobody in the car said Adrian's name. No one wondered how he had reacted, whether he had signed his own copies yet, whether he had regretted anything for even a second. For the lawyers and the driver, everything had already happened, for the clans as well. In their world, he had simply stopped being a problem, realizing that hurt and freed him at the same time. They really had erased him, from the surname, from the schedules, from future projects. And that was exactly what gave him a chance to write himself into some different story where everything did not begin with someone else's signature. That evening, when he spread the papers out on the table in his rented apartment, the silence around him was different, not empty, not hostile, just unfilled. On this table lay no orders, no reports, no contracts signed by other people, only his name, neatly printed at the top of the page, without Kane. The signature he had put down in the morning really had erased part of his old life, but it had left the main thing, the chance that one day he would sign his name under something he chose himself, not under what the clans decided was profitable. After the divorce, Elias's life seemed to shift from widescreen drama to a narrow, almost chamber series. Instead of a penthouse with panoramic windows, there was a small apartment on the 7th floor of an old building where at night he could hear pipes creak and someone upstairs dragging furniture. Instead of a personal driver, there was the subway and the occasional taxi at weekends. Instead of Omega of the Kane clan, he was just an employee at an independent analytics agency whose name meant nothing to clients or colleagues. He chose a district far from the usual haunts of high-tier alphas, a courtyard with peeling facades, a poplar by the entrance, a small coffee stand across the street where the barista quickly memorized his order and never asked extra questions. The apartment was almost empty. A bed, a table, a couple of chairs, a sofa, a laptop, a few boxes with books. He promised himself he would gradually make the space his own, but in reality, he lived for a long time like a temporary tenant who could pack up and leave at any moment. Routine formed quickly. Morning, shower, capsule coffee, news he listened to more than watched. The commute to the office took about 40 minutes. At the agency, they greeted him calmly, checked his resume, made a couple of reference calls, and that was it. Nobody cared that he used to bear the Kane name. Here he was, simply Elias Hart, a neat, focused Omega with a good head for numbers and a habit of turning reports in slightly ahead of deadline. What he liked about the job was its lack of pomp and its predictability. Spreadsheets, charts, presentations, discussions in neutral, number-based language. Colleagues treated him evenly, without patronizing care and without prurient interest in his private life. Sometimes they invited him to company dinners. A couple of times he went, sat in the corner, listened to other people's stories, and went home with a strange light dizziness from realizing how peaceful life could be when no one saw you as part of a strategic alliance. From the outside, this all looked like a textbook success story about leaving a toxic relationship. The Omega walked away from a cold alpha, changed his circle, found a job, rented a place, no longer walked the carpets on which he used to pretend to be happy. If someone wrote a post about it, the comments would probably be full of proud of him and good for him for leaving. Inside, it was more complicated. 8 years next to Adrian did not wipe out with a new commute. His body remembered too well the smell of his suits, the rhythm of his steps in the corridor, the soft click of his office door closing. In the evenings, coming back to his little kitchen, Elias sometimes caught himself listening for a lock clicking, a lift humming, the air changing the way it used to change when a strong alpha stepped into a room. Then he remembered where he was, and it made him feel both ashamed and empty. The media, meanwhile, lived their own separate life. A couple of months after the divorce, the feeds filled with news of Adrian's engagement. First, there was a neat leak to a lifestyle magazine. Close-up shots of the ring on Ryan's hand, described as a legend of the music industry and the man who melted the heart of the most closed-off alpha in the capital. Then came reposts, analysis, expert commentary about how the Kane-Lawson alliance would change the balance of power. Elias did not go looking for those materials, but they seeped in anyway. His newsfeed served up headlines, acquaintances forwarded links with, "Have you seen this?" and clumsy attempts not to hurt him. On the rare days he turned on the TV, he always seemed to land on a society segment where the host, eyes shining, talked about true love finding its way through years of obligations and family pressure. He was not in those stories. Their 8-year marriage was mentioned in passing as an early union by arrangement which the parties ended in a civilized way. His name was not mentioned at all. There he existed as an unnamed footnote, a shadow in the corner of the frame an editor had neatly cut out. That felt strange. On one hand, relief. Less curiosity, fewer questions. On the other hand, a faint sense of being erased from a story in which he had lived, suffered, and grown older. Sometimes, looking at a photo of Adrian standing next to Ryan, relaxed with a slight smile, in a softer suit than he ever wore while they were married, Elias felt not just anger. Somewhere deep below the layer of hurt, a quiet truth shifted. Yes, that was how he was supposed to look next to someone he had actually chosen. And yes, in a twisted way, it was probably good that they both now had a chance not to be locked into someone else's contract. That admission did not cancel the pain. Each new report was like a slow but precise movement of a blade along an old seam. He had let Adrian go, signed the papers, agreed to freedom, and still felt like a man who had been taken off a train one stop before his station. The wedding invitation was a punch he had not seen coming. It did not come from Adrian or anyone in the family. A white envelope with the logo of a famous event agency lay in his mailbox between a food delivery flyer and his electricity bill. Inside was a thick, expensive card with embossed letters, neutral text from the ceremony organizers, and a small note at the bottom. At the request of the groom and his family, you are invited as an important part of the story. The phrase, important part of the story, left him with a blurry, muddy reaction. Where had this importance been when they erased him from interviews and press releases? Where was it when the lawyers described their divorce as reallocation of obligations? Now that the world needed a pretty picture of nobility, his presence had suddenly become useful. He read the text several times. It spoke of closing a chapter the right way, of respect for the past, of the opportunity to share the joy of a new union in an atmosphere of harmony. Between the lines, the PR logic was obvious. The X Omega at the wedding was the perfect proof that no one had been abandoned, that everything was clean, civilized, without blood and scandal. An alpha who could invite his ex automatically looked more magnanimous. Nice move, Elias thought as he laid the card on the table. For several days, he pretended he had not accepted the invitation. The envelope lay by his laptop, a white patch on the dark surface, and each time he passed by, he felt his eyes snag on it like on a sharp edge. Sometimes he wanted to just throw it down the chute without opening the mailbox flap to hear it fall. Sometimes he wanted the opposite, to send an immediate refusal, short and official. He did neither. The decision to go ripened slowly, like a heavy tart fruit no one wanted to pick. One evening he sat on the floor of his apartment, back against the sofa, and replayed the last 8 years. The memories came not in order but by intensity. The first cold dinner, the dumb silence in the car after a reception, nights when he counted the breaths of the man in the next room, the scene with the papers at the legal center, the hollow feeling in his chest afterwards. Up to this point, he had almost always taken a passive position. They had set things in front of him, invited him, summoned him, signed for him, written scripts where he was a necessary but silent part of the decor. Even leaving the marriage had partly been part of someone else's plan, one he had agreed to. The thought of choosing to walk into a place where they would try to use him again as an element of someone else's story at first sounded like painful self-torture. But the longer he thought, the clearer it became. Not going would mean letting that scene play out without him, letting others arrange the accents and put the final dot he never saw. Going would mean walking into that hall on purpose, looking at everything with his own eyes and deciding for himself what it meant to him. He was deeply afraid of seeing Adrian's gaze with nothing but calm gratitude in it, gratitude that he had come to play the role assigned to him, afraid of the cameras, the society reporters, the sticky phrases about maturity and knowing how to let go. Afraid that at some point he would break, turn around and leave before the end, and the carefully built image of a controlled man would fall apart. But he was even more afraid of living on with an unfinished ending. In his inner story, everything was still paused. The divorce scene cut off at the moment he walked out of the office, And beyond that, there was only a long corridor of a new life where he did not know where the exit door was. The wedding, no matter how much of a PR farce it might be, gave him the chance to put a bold period there for himself. To see the alpha he had given 8 years of his life to, surrounded by people applauding his new choice, to confirm that, yes, this was happening, that it was real, not just pictures in a feed, to admit that it really was over. One night he simply walked over to the table, picked up the card, turned it over, and neatly wrote a few words on the back. A short, completely neutral response confirming he had received the invitation and would attend. No emotions, no extra phrases. "I will come," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. In that moment, the feeling of being a guest in his own life shifted a little. He was still a figure they would use in someone else's pretty tableau, but at least this step was his. Not because the family wanted it, not because it was good for business, but because he needed to see for himself how the curtain finally came down on the stage where he had stood in the shadows for too long. In the days leading up to the ceremony, the city really did buzz like a hive spilled over the asphalt. Adrian Kane's name popped up in news feeds more often than stock indices. Every entertainment show seemed to feel obliged to add a block about the wedding of the year. Bloggers broke down the rings, rumors, guest list. In shop windows, magazines showed glossy spreads of Adrian and Ryan in perfectly tailored suits with rehearsed looks of men who know how to be an image. At first, Elias tried to let it all slide past him. He scrolled past headlines, blocked push notifications, flipped magazines face down at the coffee shop while he waited for his order. But the information still seeped in like water into an old foundation. Colleagues discussed the wedding in the office like a weather anomaly. Some marveled at how well both families had played the game, others cynically calculated future dividends. For them, it was a perfect deal with a pretty romantic storyline on the cover. He listened to their remarks and felt a strange, almost physical dulling inside. With each new detail about the menu, music, and guest list, the world seemed to underline the same thing. This script had absolutely nothing to do with him anymore. Everything that had once been his everyday life now existed somewhere above, in another layer of reality, like a TV series he had already finished while they were filming a sequel without him. The day before the wedding, the past came back in a more tactile form. During lunch break, he got a call from an old acquaintance, the one who had once worked in the service staff at the Kane house and now was on the contractor list for the event agency. His voice was excited. Orders and dull thuds and music echoed in the background. He quickly, breathlessly described the rehearsal like a piece of gossip he just had to share. How they practiced the groom's entrance, first separately, then together, to the cut of their future theme music. How the coordinator with a tablet measured their path centimeter by centimeter, corrected their steps, the angle of their heads, the length of their pauses before the arch. How the stylists fussed over how the fabrics looked under the lights and asked for a bit more emotion in their eyes. In those fragments, there was too much drilled harmony. Even over the phone, Elias could smell the familiar scent of a display window. Everything in that hall was more about the picture than the feeling, about how it would look in photos and short videos that would spread online later. It was a rehearsal not of a marriage, but of someone else's happiness they were about to show the world. He listened, nodded in the right places, added a couple of neutral comments. Then, when the call ended, sat for a long time with the phone in his hand, feeling a slow chill crawl across his skin. Towards evening, the air grew heavier. Low clouds rolled in, and the streetlights seemed to lean closer to the ground. His apartment held that same silence he had learned to read in two ways. On one hand, it protected him. No shouting, no arguments, no heavy steps on marble floors. On the other, it sometimes turned into a cell where his own thoughts sounded too loud. He put the kettle on and never remembered if he actually made tea. He walked the room from window to table and back, sat, and stood up again. The report on his laptop screen blurred. The lines would not form meaning. His mind kept circling the same thing. 8 years spent next to a man who tomorrow would officially promise forever to someone else. There was almost no hatred left in those memories. It had burned out earlier, in the nights he lay on the edge of the huge bed, listening to the quiet click of Adrian's office door. Now, instead of rage, there was fatigue and a heavy, strange curiosity. How would his body react when he was in that crowded hall? What would the smell of fresh flowers, expensive alcohol, and mixed perfumes do to him? Would he be able to sit still listening to someone else's vows, or would he last 1 second and in the next bolt for the exit? He caught himself rehearsing too, not on purpose, not in front of a mirror, just standing in the middle of the room, quietly running through tomorrow in his head. How he would enter the hall. Calmly, a little later than most guests, so he would not be among those caught in close-up shots. How he would show the invitation at the entrance, feel the quick, assessing look of an agency employee, that ex omega, and pretend not to notice. How he would walk along the rows, feel scattered curiosity on his skin, and sit somewhere in the middle, not too close to the aisle, not at the very back. He had already chosen what he would wear. Nothing flashy or loud, no pointed display of wealth, a dark suit he already owned, a light shirt, minimal details. He did not want to become another piece of decor for the cameras to linger on. His role was to be present, not to shine. A jacket and shirt he had pulled from the wardrobe earlier that day still hung in the hallway. He had not yet forced himself to lay them out properly. It felt as if ironing the shirt would make the decision to go irreversible. For now it existed somewhere between yes and no, like the invitation on the table he could still ignore. He sat down on the edge of the bed, buried his face in his hands, and tried to be honest with himself. What exactly did he want to see tomorrow? Adrian happy with someone else? Adrian unsure? What picture was he subconsciously painting that would make it easier or harder afterwards? He had no answer. Inside there was neither let it all fall apart nor let him be truly happy. More than anything, he wanted one thing, to close this story for himself, to watch with his own eyes as the man around whom his life had revolved for 8 years said vows not to him, and survive it. To stay conscious, not run, not break. Only then, maybe, their story would really become the past, and not a frozen scene he kept going back to in his mind. The clock ticked off the time in dull, even beats. Outside, someone smoked on the fire escape. Teenagers laughed, a neighbor's door slammed. The world was getting ready for tomorrow without any drama. Malls would close on schedule, offices would finish their workday, rideshare apps would raise their prices toward evening when the guests drove home from the ceremony. Only his own body lived to a different rhythm. His heart sped up and dropped into empty gaps. His shoulders stayed slightly lifted, as if he was waiting for a hit. At night, a thought would flash across his mind. What if I just do not go? For a minute that felt like salvation. Then stubbornness kicked back in. He had let circumstances decide for him for too long. If he backed out now, he would spend the rest of his life imagining how it had been, filling in details he had never seen. He got up, opened the wardrobe, took out the suit, hung it on the door, and ran his hand over the fabric. In that moment, things became simpler. Tomorrow would just be another day when he had to leave the house, get to a certain address, walk into a hall, sit for a while, and then leave. He had lived through 8 years next to Adrian. He would live through a couple of hours in a room where other people's happiness was being rehearsed. Before going to bed, he carefully slipped the invitation into the inside pocket of his jacket, checked the alarm on his phone, and let his hand rest for a second on the light switch. I will come, he said into the darkness, without any drama, merely stating a fact. There was more of his own will in that quiet line than in all the polished vows that would be spoken tomorrow under the camera flashes. The morning was too bright. The sun beat against the glass as if someone had turned the light all the way up on purpose, and the city answered with its usual noise, honks, distant sirens, the rough hum of traffic. Elias lay for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to catch a sense of an ordinary day. It did not work. Inside, a dry vibration was already humming like a badly tuned shaker. He got up and went through his usual routine. Shower, coffee, a short message to a colleague that he would be unreachable after lunch. The man in the mirror was not someone he fully recognized. His face looked sharper than 8 years ago when they had first put him next to Adrian for a photo shoot. His gaze was calmer, but deep inside, that same caution still sat. He had chosen the suit before, but only took it out now, as if he was checking one last time whether there was still a way to back out. Dark gray, almost textureless, fitting him well but not screaming about its brand. A white shirt, a narrow tie, neutral shoes. No one will remember, it crossed his mind, and that felt oddly comforting. The ride to the venue was shorter than he had expected. The taxi pulled up to the hotel entrance a little earlier than the time listed on the invitation. Even from the street, everything looked like a carefully staged production. Smiling hostesses at the door, branded stands for the organizers, invisible but very real security. The air smelled of expensive perfume, flowers, and hairspray. Inside, the noise split and multiplied. Guest check-in, clinking glass, soft background music. A woman with a tablet asked to see his invitation, gave him a professional, non-genuine smile, checked the seating chart, and led him into the hall. His seat was in the middle, not by the aisle and far from the first rows where the families and especially important partners settled, but not by the exit either. The perfect invisibility zone where an ex-Omega could be present without dominating any camera angle. The hall was done in muted white and gold. Tall white flower arrangements rose above rows of chairs, draped fabrics softened the light, and the ceiling seemed to disappear into the backlighting. It was all beautiful, almost flawless. But that beauty felt to Elias like something he knew too well. It made him nauseous. He had seen such interiors in magazines and at presentations where every detail existed as a backdrop for someone else's success. He sat down, adjusted his cuff, feeling his palms get slightly damp despite the air conditioning. His fingers clamped onto the armrests while he drilled a simple sequence into his mind. Breathe in, breathe out. The music was still light, gentle, designed to slowly build up expectation. Guests whispered, exchanged looks. Someone had already managed to get a glass of champagne, although the ceremony had not started yet. Scents mixed into a dense backdrop. Fresh flowers gave sweetness. Alcohol added a faint bitterness. Strangers' perfumes built a complex, almost choking blend. Through it all, now and then, a familiar note slipped through. The signature scent of the Kane clan, the one their home had once reeked of. His body reacted to it faster than his mind. His shoulders rose, his stomach muscles tightened. Easy, he told himself silently, the corners of his mouth twitching in a dry half-smile. The organizing team worked like a well-oiled machine. A few minutes before the start, the lights dimmed slightly, the music changed, gaining depth. Coordinators walked along the rows, checking that no seats were empty where they should not be. Two men he recognized only from business news sat down next to him. They exchanged brief greetings and immediately dove into a discussion of some project clearly involving both families. For them, this day was not just about vows and feelings. It was another knot of connections to celebrate and fix. Elias listened to their neutral remarks and felt an old, familiar irritation stir. 8 years ago, they had treated him as part of just such a construction. Today, he sat on the other side as an ironic observer when the hall finally settled into that special, thick silence that always comes right before the main entrance. Elias felt his heartbeat stutter. A second, another, a third. And the music changed. A solemn, polished melody started to play, every note calculated for maximum effect. Adrian walked in first. He had not changed drastically, but 8 years of watching him allowed Elias to pick up the details at once. A slightly sharper jawline, faint shadows under his eyes that makeup did not hide, a perfectly straight back. The suit fit flawlessly, dark fabric, snow-white shirt, a neat boutonniere matching the hall's color scheme. He moved the way people used to attention move, confidently, without fuss, but also without theatrical arrogance. His gaze slid over the rows of guests, stopping where protocol demanded, on the families, on the key partners, on the media representatives, and yet at some point, almost by accident, his gaze passed across the middle of the hall and caught the row where Elias was sitting. It was a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, but for the Omega time stretched. He felt everything inside him clench as if someone had reached in and squeezed his heart. In that look, he expected to see relief, the look of a man who had finally escaped a locked cage, or indifference, the way you look at a long-closed chapter. But instead, he managed to catch a flicker that looked like confusion, as if his very presence here disrupted the carefully built picture. "Don't look," he threw at himself mentally, forcing his focus onto details instead. The light coming through the glass, the curves of the seat backs, the rustle of clothes around him. But his body still stored that look, short and sharp, like a splinter. Ryan appeared a little later, under his own musical accent. Light on his feet, smiling, carrying that effortless charisma that played so well in interviews. Soft tones in his suit, open posture, easy gestures. He walked toward the altar like someone who wasn't afraid to be at the center of attention. His smile was flawless, the corners of his eyes folding into perfect little creases. A soft sigh of admiration rolled through the hall. Elias had seen them together dozens of times, on screens, in magazines, in photos from private events. But here, now, in real space, without editing and retouching, the scene looked both beautiful and fragile. Beautiful because everything was built by the book. Fragile because behind the drilled poses and perfect lines, he, who was used to noticing small things, picked up the tension. In Ryan, it showed in the way his fingers gripped the bouquet a bit too tightly, and in the barely noticeable deep breath before the last few steps. In Adrian, it was in the faint, almost invisible set of his shoulders that only someone who had studied his silhouette for years from the next room would see. They took their places side by side, turning toward the officiant, and the hall seemed to take one collective breath. The cameras around the perimeter came to life. Red lights turned on, lenses shifted to find the perfect angle. Somewhere in the distance, shutters clicked. For the world, this was the moment the whole story had been leading up to. For Elias, it was the point where his personal past, his present, and the version written for the press collided. He caught himself realizing that for the first time, he was looking at them not as some abstract perfect couple, but as two living people standing at the edge of a decision. One, an alpha, with a surname that had weighed on him his whole life. The other, a beta who had somehow managed to touch something in that alpha that Elias himself had never reached. And somewhere far in the background of this scene was he, a shadow from their shared past, the tech crew of his own life, admitted here only as a detail in the legend of a proper ending. The officiant started speaking, rolling out words about love, choice, and fate. His voice was trained, smooth, used to microphones. Phrases followed one another, washing away real biographies in a clean, universal story you could lay over any couple. Elias heard that voice as a hum behind his own inner monologue. Inside, the experiment was still going. How far could he go without snapping? Every new cliché about a true bond that survived trials echoed in him as dull pain, and at the same time, a strange kind of relief. What they called trials here had been his everyday life for 8 years, and now all of that was being officially moved onto someone else's track. At some point, he realized his fingers weren't gripping the armrest so hard anymore. His breathing had evened out. His body, having survived the first hit, started adapting to the new reality. He let his shoulders drop a little, leaned back against the seat, and began to watch what was happening as a performance whose ending was still unknown, but no longer depended on him. Ahead lay the vows, the exchange of rings, endless photos and toasts. For now, the wedding day was still at a point where you could believe everything would go according to plan. And only that thin, almost invisible crack in Adrian's gaze, caught when he entered, kept Elias from believing in the perfection of this whole construction. The ceremony kept moving along its set trajectory like a perfectly rehearsed show. The officiant gently guided the couple through each step. Opening speech, the story of their journey to happiness, thanks to parents and friends. The hall responded on cue, light laughter in the right places, sympathetic sighs here and there, someone quietly dabbing the corners of their eyes with a napkin. The cameras never stopped, catching every turn of the head, every smile. Elias sat almost motionless and caught microscopic shifts a regular viewer would have missed. The further the ceremony went, the heavier the air felt around Adrian. Not around them as a couple, around the alpha himself. The officiant spoke about a choice that makes you stronger, about the courage to follow your heart. But with each of these polished lines, something in the groom's posture twitched. The hands holding the sheet with his vows shook slightly but clearly. His breathing, usually steady and controlled, caught on the exhale. Shoulders used to bearing the weight of boardrooms and press conferences suddenly seemed to feel this room as something different, heavier than yet another meeting hall, Ryan, on the other hand, looked confident. He knew how to hold a room, how to work with attention. His voice was bright, clear, coloring itself with emotion in the right places. When he said his part, about how long he had waited for this chance, how grateful he was that fate brought them together, the hall listened with pleasure. It was a perfect, well-served story, and many believed it as easily as they believed a beautiful song. Elias listened to him and to the reactions around them, but inside his attention was locked on the man standing beside him at the altar. On the man he had known in other interiors and under other scripts. The Alpha the world saw as a rock was now giving off those tiny cracks that sometimes turn into a landslide. When the officiant announced it was time to exchange vows, a near physical charge ran through the hall. People straightened in their seats, turned their heads. Someone quietly started recording on their phone. The music almost faded, leaving a soft underlay around the main scene. Ryan finished first. His speech was polished, but there was still something alive in it, either genuine awe or simply deep belief in his own story. He looked at Adrian the way you look at a long-awaited promise finally being kept. When he said, "always," not a single note in his voice shook. Everyone waited for what came next. Adrian lifted his eyes from the sheet in his hands and suddenly stopped fitting the picture. At first, the silence that followed seemed to some like a dramatic pause, a theatrical trick to heighten the moment. The officiant smiled slightly, ready to pick up after an especially touching line. A few guests in the front rows, people used to shows, even leaned forward a bit. Something very powerful was about to be said, but the pause didn't end. 1 second, 2, 3. The music died away completely. In the stillness you could hear someone awkwardly clear their throat in the back row. The paper in Adrian's hands shook more noticeably. He tried to draw a breath, but the air seemed to get stuck somewhere in his chest. Elias felt his stomach clamp into a cold ring. He knew this kind of silence too well. It was not the pause of a confident man searching for the right words. It was the silence of someone who had run into an invisible wall. The planners by the stage exchanged looks. One of them stepped forward, only to be stopped by someone behind him. Any interference at a moment like this could have been catastrophic. The cameras kept recording, red lights glowing relentlessly. The hall was frozen. Adrian was still holding the sheet with his vows, but Elias could see he wasn't looking at it anymore. His eyes, a little glassy, had shifted above the page as if, right then, the Alpha had fallen into some private picture only he could see. The officiant tried gently nudging him along, saying his name, too softly for a man like him. The hall heard it as support. Elias heard it as a clumsy attempt to drag someone back into a script he had already stepped out of. Adrian raised his head, and in the next moment, the hall's breath changed because instead of the expected speech, he did exactly what no one had put into the plan. He spoke quietly, but the microphone caught every letter. I can't. The sentence hung in the air like a wrong note. Some people didn't grasp the meaning right away, taking it for an emotional opening. But then he lowered the page with his vows without reading a word, and everything became irreversible. Next to him, Ryan stood with that same smile that a second earlier had looked like the peak of his personal story. For an instant, there was a blank, stunned emptiness in the beta's eyes. The officiant fell silent. The music didn't know what to do, and that made it feel like only one sound existed in the hall now, the crack of a structure breaking. Suits rustled in the front rows. Adrian's mother half rose from her seat, her face whitening under her makeup. Ryan's father tensed, as if ready to step in physically. But no one could keep up with how quickly everything was shifting. Adrian was looking at the hall, but Elias knew exactly where that gaze would land. He felt it long before their eyes met. The moment the Alpha's gaze cut through the rows and found him, everything else in the hall blurred out. The flowers, the gold ribbons, the expensive lighting, all of it vanished. There was only that heavy line between two people with 8 years of shared history behind them. Elias expected to see only guilt or bewilderment there, but he saw something else. In that look was a desperate, almost panicked admission. I am doing something terribly wrong. He didn't say it out loud. There was no beautiful confession, no loud declarations. Just a few seconds where the script broke. Someone in the audience was already lifting their phone higher to record the most dramatic moment. Someone else lowered their eyes, suddenly feeling they were watching something far too personal. The officiant made one more attempt to bring things back on track, asking if Adrian needed time, offering to continue later. His voice had taken on a false softness that could not hide the main thing: fear of losing control of the event. Adrian seemed not to hear him. He took a step back from the altar, breaking the perfect geometric frame of the shot. It was a small step, but it was very loud in context. A physical ripple ran through the hall like a sudden gust of wind. Ryan stayed where he was, no longer smiling. His face now held the realization that their shared story had just gained an irreversible fracture. Elias sat pinned to his seat, his heart pounding in his temples. Part of him wanted to get up and leave before everything turned into a full-blown farce, with him once again made into a shadow for someone else's drama. Another part would not let him look away, like when you refuse to cut off a song halfway through just as it changes key. Inside him, a chaotic argument raged. "Don't you dare think this is because of you," one part snapped. "And what if it is?" another asked coldly, remembering that brief look at the entrance, the pause before the vow, this cutting stare across the hall. Time fully slipped its frame. For some, everything happening took only a few seconds. For Elias, it stretched like film you could inspect frame by frame. Adrian finally moved. He did not start apologizing. He didn't try to explain to the guests what he felt or craft a neat line people could later quote. He simply did something he had never once allowed himself in public space. He walked out of his role, one step, then another. First, toward the officiant, who instinctively stepped aside to clear the way. Then, straight down the aisle between the chairs. Where moments ago the two of them were supposed to walk as a newlywed couple, now went one man, breaking everything built around him. The hall rustled, flinched, tried to decide how to react. Someone reached out to him, someone shrank back. Eyes flicked between the couple at the altar and the aisle, between the parents and the planners. Somewhere off to the side, the first versions of what had happened were already being born. Panic attack, cold feet, hidden conflict. Elias at that moment thought only of one thing. Would he manage to get up and leave before that man got too close? He did not. When Adrian reached the middle of the hall, their eyes met again. This time, the alpha did not look away. In that straight, open, painfully honest gaze, there was something Elias had never seen in him when they posed for family photos or sat side by side at official dinners. It held everything at once: guilt, fear, anger at himself, and something else that took Elias's breath away because he had no name ready for it. Suddenly, the chair under him no longer felt safe, as if this seat was exactly where he would now be unwrapped in front of everyone, made into part of someone else's crisis. His body reacted faster than his mind. His fingers let go of the armrests. His legs shifted, ready to lift him. "Not now," whispered some very small, very tired part inside. But the world had no intention of listening. Adrian stopped a few steps from the row where Elias sat. 2 chairs and a thin, invisible line called "Too Late" still lay between them. He said his name. Just that one word was enough to erase the script completely. No staging could have allowed for a moment when the groom, leaving his partner at the altar, turned to his ex in the audience and said his name in a voice stripped of every polished public layer and businesslike chill. For Elias, hearing his name like that was both a sentence and a plea. In it lay everything unsaid over 8 years, unspoken apologies, aborted confessions, conversations that never happened. A wave of whispers rose through the hall. Some people recognized him, remembering old pieces where a previous Omega partner of Cain had been mentioned in passing. Some only now grasped that he was not just some random guest. In the middle of the room, the legend of a flawless love story was shattering, and fragments were flying in all directions. Elias sat there feeling all those gazes slowly converge on him. This was exactly the kind of moment he had always tried to avoid. Not being an invisible shadow, but the center of someone else's disaster. But he was already in it, and then it finally hit him that right now it was not just the fate of a new couple being decided. This was where it would be determined what those 8 years had been to Adrian, a convenient mistake you shrug off without regret, or something that could not be erased by divorce papers, a new name on the guest list, or a perfectly staged wedding. The broken script no longer protected anyone. Not Ryan, frozen at the altar. Not the families watching the ground slide out from under their plans. Not Adrian himself, standing in the aisle with another man's name on his lips. It was right in this crack, against a backdrop of whispers and blinking cameras, that Elias for the first time in years felt his own choice. To leave, to sign, to let go. Suddenly stop being the final point. The moment after Adrian said his name stretched like cracked glass. The music still played somewhere, but it had turned to empty background noise. The first real sound Elias heard was not a chord or the officiant's voice, but a single, compressed breath from hundreds of people. One heavy, sticky inhale full of collective shock. He felt dozens, hundreds of looks on him, as if every spotlight had turned to a single point. This was what he had always feared, not being the invisible background, but the center of events. And yet at the exact moment he wanted most to fade back into a shadow and sink into his seat, the world shoved him onto center stage. Adrian stood in the aisle with his sheet of vows hanging at his side, like a man who had just kicked out his own support. His face clearly showed an internal break, not melodrama, not theatrical struggle with fate, but a stunned realization he could not move any further along the route laid out for him. Between duty and choice, a chasm had opened, and it had cracked right in front of everyone. Planners hovered near the stage like people trying to hold up set pieces in a rising storm. The officiant still clung to the microphone, ready to say anything, turn it into a joke, declare a technical pause. The families in the front rows were on their feet, stunned and furious. Camera operators pressed in close to their viewfinders, hardly believing their professional luck. The scandal of the year was unfolding right in their frame. Ryan stood by the altar for a long moment without moving at all. His usual smile slid from his face like a poorly fastened mask. The mix of anger and pain in his features might have been heartbreaking under other circumstances, if not for one detail. No one in that hall was safe now. Not him, not Adrian, not anyone watching. Adrian took another step down the aisle, just one, but it cut him off for good from the white arch, from the flowers, the music, and the scripted forever. The movement was awkward and absolutely honest. The Alpha was walking not toward the exit, not toward a side door where PR people could immediately take over, but toward the place where a man sat who, on paper, had nothing to do with him anymore. Elias gripped the armrests so hard his knuckles went white. The first thought that flashed through him was simple, almost animal. Leave. Now. Stand up, slip past, disappear into the crowd before anyone pinned him down with their eyes. He even felt the muscles in his legs tense, ready to hoist him to his feet. Anywhere but here. Anywhere but on me, flared up inside like a short, desperate prayer. But it was too late. Adrian had already closed most of the distance between them, faces blurred at the edges of his vision. Only that approaching figure remained, the man he had spent 8 years trying to either block out or escape from, the man he had officially let go just a few months ago. Their eyes met again, now at a very different distance. Adrian's eyes held too much at once, fear, guilt, stubbornness, almost childish disbelief in what he had just done. The only thing missing was the familiar icy detachment that Elias had come to accept as the default. That, more than anything, was what hit him. He jerked, trying to stand, at the same time making room and clinging to some semblance of control. It came out clumsy. The chair creaked, his neighbor turned, someone's knees, someone's bag. The world broke into a messy tangle of small obstacles. And in that mess, a hand landed on his forearm. The touch was painfully familiar. A heavy, warm, alpha grip his body remembered better than his mind wanted to admit. For a split second, everything after the divorce vanished. The new apartment, the independent job, the nights without Adrian's scent in his bed. Instead, his memory served up entirely different nights, different walls. "Don't you dare," he breathed, barely audible, not even sure if Adrian heard him, but Adrian had already gone past the point where a panicked "don't" could drag him back. He leaned in closer, just enough that the nearest microphones wouldn't catch them, and said hoarse, as if each word tore his voice from somewhere deep, "Let's get out of here." 2 words, no explanations, no apologies, no, "I'll explain later." Just this, an offer to run presented to the man he had once turned into a prisoner, Rage surged up in Elias, thick and almost black. 8 years of silent wounds, 8 years of unsaid sorry, 8 years of being ordered rather than asked. And now this man was blowing up his own wedding and asking him to leave, together. "Let go," he said a little louder. The anger put steel in his voice. The hand on his arm twitched but didn't fall away. The tension in that grip felt almost painful, as if Adrian wasn't holding onto someone else's skin but hanging onto the edge of a cliff. Off to the side, a different voice cut through, one of the relatives, full of outrage and panic. Someone tried to grab Adrian by the shoulder, to hold him back, to bark, "What are you doing?" That voice wasn't afraid for a son or a partner. It was afraid for the name, the reputation, the display window being smashed to pieces in front of them. Adrian didn't turn. He simply stepped aside, opening the aisle, and almost physically pulled Elias out of the row. Elias managed to yank his arm free, but that movement was enough to bring him fully to his feet. Now they were standing together, facing the aisle, under the hail of stares and cameras. And then something happened that no one, including Elias himself, had expected. He took the first step, not because he forgave, not because he agreed with what was happening, but because there was no safe place left for him in that hall. Sitting back down would mean staying in a show where he was being turned into a symbol against his will. Stepping into the aisle and walking forward meant at least choosing the direction of his own steps. He walked, slowly, like someone who didn't yet understand exactly where he was going, but knew there was no way back. Half a step behind him walked Adrian. His presence felt like a field stretched taut between Elias's back and the air. The hall parted in front of them reluctantly, like water before a boat. The whisper grew louder with each second. It was no longer just a background murmur, but a real roar in which key words could be picked out. Scandal, breakdown, X, Omega. What is he doing? Cameras swung to follow, catching faces out of the crowd. Ryan's stricken expression at the altar, the parents' white faces, the guests' stunned looks. The officiant made a final attempt to haul the ceremony back into its lane. His voice, hoarse with sudden tension, carried from the stage where only moments ago a pretty legend had been meant to play out. He said something about a technical break, about asking everyone to stay seated, but the words no longer had any power. The script that had cost so much money and effort was falling apart like sand. Halfway to the exit, Elias felt his legs start to buckle. The adrenaline that had carried him through the first seconds was wearing off, leaving only emptiness and shaking behind. The farther they got from the altar, the stronger one thought became. What next? What was he doing? Why had he even stood up? Stop, he thought, but what came out of his mouth was something else. Please, not here. The phrase slipped out almost in a whisper, but Adrian heard it. He didn't slow, but he did change course. Instead of heading for the main doors where journalists and relatives would have encircled them immediately, he veered sharply into a side passage leading toward the service areas. It was darker and quieter there. The roar of the hall stayed behind them, a heavy, muffled mass. The narrow corridor with its neutral gray walls looked like the business spaces where they had once decided the fate of contracts. Now, a different fate was being decided here, a far more personal one. They stopped only when they reached a small recess by a back exit, where, at least for a few minutes, cameras and curious eyes couldn't reach them. The corridor smelled of conditioned air, dust, and something else, that familiar alpha scent that made Elias's insides twist. There was finally some space between them, a few steps. Adrian's hand, which had been holding him, dropped away. He was bent slightly forward as if he had just finished a marathon, though they had walked only a few dozen meters. The silence was heavy, cutting. Outside, somewhere far away, music still played. Someone was speaking into a microphone. Someone was calling this a situation. Someone was already typing it up online. But here, in this narrow corridor, the world had shrunk to two people who, for the first time in years, were standing face to face without witnesses, contracts, or pre-assigned roles. Elias's fingers were shaking. He felt cold sweat running slowly down his back. Words fought in his throat, begging to be shouted, accusations, questions, delayed anger. Why? Why now? What have you done? You've wrecked not just your life, but someone else's. All of it raged inside like a storm spinning up. He managed only one line. You've lost your mind. It was not a figure of speech, more a statement of fact. The man who had always lived by calculations of cost and benefit had just made a public move that fit no rational formula. Adrian gave a short, joyless, almost painful smile. "Maybe," he said. His voice was rough, as if from shouting, though he hadn't raised it once in the hall. They fell silent again. Every new word now felt like it could either finish off or salvage something they did not yet understand. Within that silence, a fact slowly surfaced that neither of them could dodge. Adrian had blown up his own wedding not for some principle, not to play against his family's, not as a clever move in some media chess game. At the moment he had to choose, his instincts took him not to the altar, not to his parents, not toward the exit, but to the place where sat the man he had once reduced to an invisible piece on the board. For Elias, that realization was not comforting. It was a new wound, one that both cut and, in a twisted way, freed. For 8 years, his existence had been diminished to a convenient function, and now, after he had done everything to walk out of that role, that same alpha had, at exactly the worst possible time, recognized him as a point of support. The runaway from the altar scene that hundreds had just witnessed turned out, at its core, to be an escape from a lie they had both propped up for far too long. Only this time, the price of that realization would not fall onto paper contracts, but onto living people, onto Ryan, onto the families, onto Elias himself, who would now have to live in a world where his name was back on other people's lips. But the echoes of the public reaction had not yet reached this corridor. Here there were only the two of them, one with a wrecked wedding behind him, the other with 8 years that had just stopped being just a mistake. And that was the first frightening step toward no longer being extras in their own story. After the door to the service corridor closed behind them, the world split in two. Outside, the buzz, the camera flashes, urgent headlines, calls from family lawyers and PR teams. Inside, the stale air of a back exit, the sterile light of ceiling panels, and 3 people who had no one left to hand the responsibility off to. Silence here was not protection, but a forced pause before they would finally have to say out loud what they had pushed into the farthest corner for years. Security found them quickly, not to protect Elias, but because a collapse ceremony in front of hundreds of guests demanded immediate containment. They were taken to a small, windowless meeting room where contracts were usually discussed. A table in the center, a few chairs, a jug of water. It all looked almost ridiculous against what had just happened in the hall. A "Do Not Enter" sign went up on the door. A senior relative tried to force his way in and was politely but firmly blocked. The families were promised clarity later. For now, the 3 of them had to provide that clarity to one another. Ryan sat first, almost demonstratively brushing back the lapels of his expensive suit. His hands shook, but when he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly steady. In that steadiness, there was no coldness, just a grown, hard-earned attempt not to explode. He said something simple. What had happened at the altar could not be written off as stress or a sudden fear of marriage. Adrian had not looked like a man who had stumbled over formality. He had looked like a man who, in a single moment, understood he was standing in the wrong place. Elias listened with his gaze lowered. Every sound hurt physically. Ryan voiced things Elias would never have dared to say himself, that you could not treat the Omega they had erased from the public version of the story as just a youthful mistake or a past relationship. No matter how much you might want to believe otherwise, those 8 years still were a serious part of who Adrian had become. Ryan admitted that his feelings for Adrian had been real, not calculation, not a clever game. He had seen in him a strong, composed alpha who could take a hit, manage chaos, and never allow himself weakness. Next to that version of Adrian, he had felt safe as a partner, in business and in life. And only now, in this room, was he being forced to see the other side, the one that remained tied to the man sitting across from him, the quiet Omega everyone had assumed he had moved on from. "I loved you as the version of yourself you chose to show me," he said, and that line hung in the air like a verdict. There was no hysteria in his voice, only exhaustion and bitter understanding. Their union had been built on a carefully filtered part of Adrian, a part that had no space for uncontrollable feelings or old attachments that had never been worked through. For Elias, those words sounded like someone else's diagnosis, one that explained everything and made nothing easier. He could see Ryan was not trying to turn him into the enemy. The beta looked at him with tension, but without the quiet contempt so often reserved for exes. He honestly acknowledged the problem was not Elias, and not only him. The problem was that Adrian had been torn too long between his role as controlling alpha and a man terrified of his own dependence. When Adrian finally spoke, the air in the room grew thicker. He sat with his elbows on the table and was silent for a while, as if testing whether his voice would hold up for the first sentences. His usual armor, cold confidence, short, precise wording, had cracked. Instead, he started with the last thing anyone expected from him, by confessing that he had hated not only Elias but himself beside him. He said that, in his early 20s, he had seen the Omega as a tool his family had handed him. Right, convenient, advantageous. A person meant to fill the marriage slot in their overall business scheme. With him, he was not supposed to feel anything, just perform functions. But life, as it often does, had refused to follow the instruction sheet. In everyday life, strange little things kept surfacing and getting under Adrian's skin. The way Elias quietly moved meetings in his schedule that were clearly bad for him. The way he anticipated crises before they hit. The way he knew how to leave a room just before the most humiliating thing was said out loud. Adrian did not want to admit that he was getting used to leaning on that presence. The stronger that dependence became, the harsher he tried to cut it off. The coldness, the sarcasm, the parade of lovers, the late nights, the way he ignored Elias's scent, all of that, as he now said, had been not just punishment for the Omega, but an attempt to prove to himself that he could live without him. The hatred he wrapped around every contact between them had been a convenient screen. It was so much easier to be angry at a forced pairing than to admit that this one person scared him precisely because Elias saw him in the moments when he did not have control. Elias listened and felt something shifting inside, deep down. No explanation could erase specific episodes of humiliation, the nights alone, the years when he lived next to a man who managed to keep his distance even in rut. And yet the admission that something had been happening behind that ice wall all this time broke the picture he had been carefully growing. He never wanted me. He never needed me. I was only a surname and a contract. Adrian did not ask for forgiveness in so many words, but every time he said, "I was afraid. I was hiding. I used you," it sounded more honest than any rehearsed, "I'm sorry." He openly admitted that he had pulled Ryan into a relationship that was supposed to be his way out of the emotional trap. A smart, attractive beta who did not demand that same depth of involvement had seemed like the perfect solution. He could love safely, controlling the degree of closeness. He could build a couple that looked perfect in front of cameras. He could finally close the chapter of the wrong marriage. "I wanted to burn the bridge and convince myself there was nothing left behind me," he said, and Elias felt something inside him jerk painfully. It turned out that all those years he had lived not just in someone's shadow, but on that very bridge that another man had been trying to blow up without looking. Listening to that, Ryan seemed to age a few years. There was no theatrical grief on his face, but the fatigue lay over his features like a heavy shadow. He said quietly, almost gently, that he refused to become just another tool in someone else's escape from himself. His feelings for Adrian did not become less real because of this, but he was not going to build a life on a foundation in which a lie had been poured in from the start. There was no blackmail in that sentence, just a fact. He would leave this room not as a groom, but as someone who had chosen to keep himself whole. What stunned Elias was how differently the two of them, he and Ryan, had been written into the story of the same alpha. One as the invisible anchor no one was supposed to know about, the other as the perfect shop window the world was admiring. And both had ended up being used in a strategy Adrian himself now called destructive. The clearing the rubble in that room really did feel like cleaning up after a collapse. First, you had to admit that the building you had spent so long constructing had, in fact, fallen down. Without that, you could neither rebuild nor walk away. Adrian said things out loud he had never even let himself think before. That he had no right to lead Ryan to the altar while he was still wrapping 8 years with Elias into a convenient label of mistake. That by signing the divorce, he had not freed either Elias or himself all the way. That refusing at the very last moment was not a heroic gesture, but a late, clumsy tearing off of his mask. The strangest thing for Elias was feeling how his own hatred was losing its simplicity. Before, everything had been clear. A cruel, cold alpha, a broken life, 8 years of isolation. Now he had to deal with a more complicated picture. A man who had caused pain had, all this time, also been running from something inside himself and had used the people closest to him as a shield. That did not excuse anything, but it did take away his right to see himself only as a victim. By the time their conversation wound down, the room was almost quiet. Each of them had said more than he had planned. Ryan stood up first. There was a firmness in the way he moved. He would not stay to watch the other two trying to dig something out of ruins that might simply not be salvageable. He left without slamming the door, and behind him stayed a strange mix of respect and loss. Adrian and Elias remained alone. The years of pain, resentment, and mistrust were still lying between them. But on top of that, there was now a new layer. The realization that neither of them wanted to repeat the same pattern where feelings were wrapped in hatred and people were used as parts in family strategies. Clearing the rubble was only beginning. Ahead lay hard conversations with their families, surviving the media wave, deciding what to do with the financial fallout of the ruined wedding. But in that small room, the main thing had already happened. For the first time, they had looked honestly at what they had done to each other. And that honesty, late, rough, often ugly, still gave them a chance not to build the next chapter of their lives on the same fragile, lying foundation. In the weeks that followed, everything that had happened on the wedding day slowly settled like dust after an explosion. On the outside, the world went through its usual scandal cycle. Headlines screamed about the broken union, family ethics experts talked about the crisis of marriage as an institution, columnists wrote sharp pieces about how even ideal alpha couples could not bear the pressure. Then the wave moved on, switching to another public disaster, and the story of Adrian, Ryan, and the former Omega quietly left the front pages. Inside that silence, the hardest part was only starting. The cracks in the Kane and Lawson names were patched by lawyers and PR people, but no crisis team could seal the cracks between the people themselves. Ryan left honestly and quietly, without plotting public revenge. He handed the Kane family his terms for ending their business ties, walked away from some projects, kept his dignity, and allowed himself to step off the field where they had used him as a beautiful exit from someone else's trap. His voice slowly faded from the media. But in their shared story, he remained an important figure, proof that it is possible to choose yourself without becoming the enemy. Adrian more or less disappeared for a while. He sharply cut down his public appearances, delegated most external functions, and moved meetings into closed formats. To the world, that looked like the standard move of a rich alpha going through a personal crisis. For Elias, it felt different. The man who had always stood in the first row had suddenly chosen to step back, not out of pride, but, it seemed, because for the first time he needed time not to build another strategy, but to deal with himself. Elias went back to his new, carefully rebuilt life. Morning commute to the analytic agency, spreadsheets, reports, dry discussions of markets with colleagues who knew him simply as a good specialist. An apartment where no one walked at night from room to room with heavy footsteps. Evening walks with headphones, where other people's stories finally drowned out his own. From the outside, nothing about him said that he had once sat in the eye of a media storm. Their first meetings after that rubble room did not take place in the old penthouse and not even in the family offices. That was a matter of principle. They chose neutral ground, a small office in the city center where a therapist worked who specialized in couples from high circles, people used to solving everything with money and contracts. Here, there was little talk of money and a lot of honest conversation. At the first joint session, Elias spoke more than in all the years of their marriage. Not because something crashed out of him, but because he understood. If he did not set the rules now, the system would drag them back into the old script. Calmly, without hysteria, he said a few things that would become the frame for this new format. He would not move back into the Kane house. Ever. Not as a guest, not as a partner, not as, let's try again. His apartment, however modest compared to their past luxury, was his territory and a symbol of the fact that at least once in his life he had chosen himself. He would not wear anyone else's surname again. His own, however lightweight it looked in the business world, was now part of his new identity. Going back under another name would be regression, not progress. He promised nothing about romance. No, start from scratch. No, give us another chance. The only thing he was willing to try was to figure out what, if anything, was left between them once fear, duty, and habit were wiped away. And to do that not alone, but with a professional who would not let them turn their feelings back into strategy. Adrian listened without interrupting. For a man used to controlling any discussion, that in itself was an act of strength, to hold back his tongue while someone else drew boundary lines. At some point he said just one short sentence without any attempt to push, without sarcasm. I agree. That was the start of their new deal, unwritten, unstamped, and all the more fragile for it. They agreed that for a while they would only meet in therapy. No late-night calls, no sudden knocks on the door. No, we just need to talk in the hope of sneaking around the hard topics. Every meeting would happen in a space where there was a third person present who could stop them when either of them tried to run back into familiar roles. Separately, they both started their own work. Adrian, who had spent his whole life being trained to be effective, not honest, suddenly discovered he had no language to describe his fear. In individual sessions, he admitted how dependence on someone else's scent, presence, voice had irritated him. How it had been easier to pretend none of that existed and shove the omega into the wrong marriage box than to admit that his weakest spots were tied to this one person. He had to learn basic things that are simple for many people. How to sit with someone else's anger, how not to take "I'm hurting" as an attack, how not to run in the direction where you can solve everything with a lawyer's phone call. The alpha, who had always knocked walls down, was now trying not to hammer on them, but to listen, even when every word went against his instinct to control. Elias, at his own sessions, ran into a different side. He suddenly saw how deeply he had absorbed the idea that his feelings carried no weight, that his only ability was to adapt, to bend, to fade into the background. He practiced saying, "This doesn't work for me. I don't want this. I need time," without automatically bracing for punishment. He was learning to tell his own desire apart from the loyalty he had been trained to feel toward the man he had lived with for so long. Little by little, their joint sessions stopped being just a stage for listing grievances and became something like a negotiation room. Not the kind where companies' fates are decided, but the kind where an old relationship contract is rewritten. They went back to episodes from the past and sorted them out not to justify anything, but to stop seeing each other only through the lens of old hurts. Once they spent a full session unpacking their very first year of marriage, the one that had felt like solid ice. It turned out that in those very same scenes, they had seen totally different things. Where Elias remembered only cold silence and Adrian walking out of the bedroom, Adrian had been gripped by a panicky fear of getting used to him too quickly. Where the alpha thought he was giving the omega freedom by not forcing closeness, Elias had received it as the lowest form of rejection. It hurt to admit how different their inner pictures had been, but that was exactly what showed how little they had tried to speak human words to each other back then, preferring to read the wrong signals. At the same time as this emotional restoration, there was practical work to do. The world had not gone anywhere, and their surnames still meant something. At some point, an idea surfaced that sounded both crazy and oddly logical. To use their shared experience not just as personal trauma, but as a resource. Adrian came to one session with a proposal that was still too dry in his usual style. To create a foundation or project that would help people who, like them, had been used as pieces in families and corporations. Omegas forced into marriages for the sake of joint assets. Betas kept in the shadows until it became profitable to put their faces on a deal. Alphas who had no idea what they were doing to the people beside them until it was too late. Elias reacted with suspicion at first. It sounded too much like another charity strategy, Rich clans liked to use as cover, but the more they talked details, the clearer it became. The idea only made sense if he, Elias, was not the Foundation's decorative Omega standing next to a noble Alpha, but a co-founder whose voice carried equal weight. He laid that out precisely. "If we do this," he said, "we do it as two people, not as an Alpha with a guilt project. I am not your project anymore." Those words hit Adrian and freed him at the same time. He was used to paying off guilt with action, money, deals, big initiatives. Admitting that here his status and resources did not give him the right to decide for both of them was not easy. But he agreed, not just in words, but in writing. When they sat in a lawyer's office to formalize the new foundation, the scene felt oddly familiar. The same glass partitions, the same smell of coffee and paper, the same neat folders. Only this time, their names stood side by side in one field, co-founders. No footnotes about marital status, no dominant party clarified in brackets. As he signed the documents, Elias noticed that his hand shook less than on the day he had signed away their pair bond. Back then, his name had been erased. Now, it was being written into a new structure, not as an add-on, but as one of its pillars. Their new deal did not end with the foundation. The paperwork was only an outer contour. The real agreement was being drawn slowly, in small things. In the way Adrian stopped showing up without warning, respecting someone else's time and space. In the way Elias allowed himself to sometimes call first without feeling that he was showing weakness. In the way they learned to tolerate pauses where they did not know what to say, instead of running back into their old roles. They did not make big promises to each other. There was no forever, no till death do us part. Their new deal was much more concrete and much more honest, not to use each other as shields from their own fears, not to hide major decisions behind contracts, not to pretend they felt nothing when everything inside was saying the opposite. Some days it worked, some days it did not. There were days when old reflexes took over, and Elias caught himself wanting to retreat, dissolve, not get in the way. There were moments when Adrian still tried to decide for both of them, wrapping it in the words, "I'm just trying to take care of you." On those days, they had to go back to talking, to therapy, to painful clarifications. Even those backslides were different now. Before, any crack became another brick in the wall of hatred. Now, each collision became material for that new agreement they were writing themselves, not with lawyers. At some point, one of the therapists remarked that their story was a rare case of people with so much power voluntarily agreeing to learn how to be vulnerable. Elias only smirked at that. Inside, he understood. Vulnerability was their only chance not to find themselves back in the same cage, just painted a different color. Their new deal between equals was far from finished. It was being rewritten every day, in the way Adrian texted, "Can I come by?" instead of "I'm on my way," in the way Elias could honestly say, "I'm not ready yet," in the way they sat together over applications to the foundation, discussing other people's stories, and for the first time, feeling equally responsible not only for each other, but for those who had no one else to go to. This was not a happy ending. It was a rare case in their world of two people who, after destroying the display, decided not to build a new facade, but to find out how possible it was to live without one. A year passed after the ruined wedding. In that year, the world went through a couple more loud divorces, a few financial crashes, and one glossy campaign about healthy alpha-omega relationships. Their story was carefully filed away into the news archive, left as a handful of memes and one long think piece about how an ideal media picture can crumble the moment a real person says no. For Elias, that year felt denser than the previous 8. For the first time, his days did not spin around someone else's calendar and were not subordinated to someone else's negotiations. He woke not to the hum of the penthouse elevator, but to the alarm he had set himself, and from there began a world where his name was not an appendix to Cain. He learned small things that had once felt like forbidden luxury, blocking out a day off in his calendar and actually not answering anyone, postponing an awkward call instead of getting up in the middle of the night because some alpha on the other side of the planet wanted to talk to Asia, inviting friends over without checking the house owner's schedule, throwing away flowers when he didn't like their smell instead of tolerating a bouquet, because it looks good in photos. Sometimes in the evenings he sat by the window of his small apartment, looked at the city lights, and caught himself on the thought that he was simply living. No drama, no grand gestures, no constant expectation of a blow. That sense of ordinary life turned out to be the air he had been missing in all those years of display marriage. Adrian, in all that time, did not disappear either. They did not dissolve into strangers' lives, did not drift apart into parallel orbits. Instead, a new, strange trajectory formed between them, neither married life nor a contract alpha-omega bond, but something that did not have a ready-made name. He was still the same man people feared in boardrooms, tough, collected, quick with decisions when it came to money and influence, but every time he called Elias or stood at his door, there was a different tone under his voice. Not an order, not an expectation, but a careful, "Are you free to talk?" instead of the old, "I need you to." The first time Elias crossed the threshold of the Kane home after the divorce, he did it not at the family's call and not because of a deal. He chose the time himself. He laid down his own condition. No witnesses, no relatives, no, "We're all so happy for you." Just him and Adrian in a space that had once been their shared cage, and now would either stop being frightening or remain foreign forever. The penthouse had changed, not beyond recognition, but enough that his body stopped bracing for familiar traps. Some rooms had been turned into workspaces. Where their old bedroom had been, there was now a strict meeting room. Their former family salon had become a neutral space for the foundation's meetings. The most important thing for Elias was something else. There were no wedding photos on the walls anymore, not theirs, not glossy mock-ups from the ceremony that never happened. Instead, there were a few abstract paintings brought up from the office and a couple of framed landscapes he recognized from his own old shots. Adrian had not thrown them out in a fit of starting from scratch, but he had not put them on pedestals either. They simply existed. "I don't want this house to ever be someone's display again," Adrian said, and there was no theatricality in his voice. Just a sober admission. One carefully built stage set had already destroyed too many lives. In that same year, their foundation had also grown flesh. At first, there were just a few requests from omegas and betas whom families and employers had used as bargaining chips. Then people started talking about the project quietly in closed circles, and the inbox filled with letters from those who recognized their own cages in the story of an omega and an alpha who had gotten out. Adrian and Elias spent evenings reading those letters, each on his own side of the table, and it was closer to partnership than anything they had had in business before. Sometimes Elias caught himself reacting to tiny, almost invisible changes. Adrian, who once wrote, "Tomorrow at 9, now asked whether this or that day worked for him. The alpha who had once wrecked a wedding to run to him now learned to stop when he saw exhaustion on his face. The man who used to demand loyalty learned to sit with the sentence, "I need to be alone," without taking it as a threat. There was no moment when they officially got back together. No second wedding, no joint social media post, no interview, just a series of quiet, almost everyday steps. First, Elias began staying over at Adrian's not because of late meetings, but because it was simply calmer that way. Then, a few of his things migrated into the closet there, not as guest clothes, but as the ones he reached for in the mornings. Then one day they found themselves planning a trip, and in that trip there were no third parties and no obligatory family visits. The main marker of change was not romance, but the way they handled conflict now. Before, any quarrel turned into a silent war. Closed doors, razor-sharp polite phrases, demonstrative ignoring. Now, when an old trigger surfaced again, instead of the old, "Do whatever you want," there was a quiet, "Stop, we're going in circles again." Sometimes it still looked ugly. There were nights when one of them walked out and slammed the door. Days when Elias almost ran back to his small apartment to hide from any decisions. But the difference was that now, after that, there was always a conversation. Not in the same hour, not in the same minute, but within a time frame normal for living people, with words like, "I was scared. I heard something you didn't say. I'm still afraid to be close, but I'm more afraid to lose you." Their hatred did not magically vanish. It stayed in their memory like a heavy, dull note, like the lowest register their bond had once played on. Elias still sometimes remembered sitting alone in the dark, counting the footsteps on the other side of the door, and his body reacted physically to that memory. But now that recollection served as a reference point for both of them. If a new decision began to smell like that same cold, that same falseness, they stepped back. Adrian, for his part, did not pretend everything had been wiped clean. He did not demand forget and forgive, the way those who were tired of their own guilt often do. He acknowledged that much of what he had done was beyond repair, that no amount of love now could erase 8 years lived in the sense of being used, and it was that acceptance of what could not be changed that made their current closeness more honest. They were not building it as a replacement for the past, but as something that could grow over scar tissue. A year after the ruined wedding, there were no more grand receptions in the Kane penthouse. The family still did business, of course, but the apartment itself had become more of a working base and private space than a stage. One evening, as the city outside drowned in soft lights and traffic hummed below, they sat on a couch covered in printouts of new applications to the foundation. Elias reread a letter from an Omega about to be married off to a business partner and felt that old nauseating taste of injustice. Adrian sat in silence, listening as he went through the dangerous lines in the proposed contract. It was one of those rare moments when their shared pain was not a curse, but a tool to save someone else. At one point, Elias leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and said almost automatically, "If someone had laid it all out for me like that back then, I'd have left earlier." Adrian paused. His gaze grew heavier, but he did not try to justify himself. He only answered quietly, "Back then you had no one, now they have you." That short, imperfect line meant more to Elias than any vow. He heard in it not another attempt to buy forgiveness, but an admission that his voice, his experience, his pain had become a support for others instead of just an ornament in someone else's biography. A year later, he walked into the Kane home not as an Omega returned to his place, but as a man who chose for himself where he wanted to be. Adrian did not meet him at the elevator like before, but at the door. No security, no witnesses, just simple human relief in his eyes. No words about second chances, no big phrases, just a quiet, "I'm glad you came." He did not answer right away. He took off his coat, felt the smell of a home that no longer reeked of other people's expectations. Just coffee, paper, a trace of his own perfume, and the warm, familiar scent of someone he knew better than he liked to admit. "So am I," he said. And that simple, "so am I," became their small but very precise vow. This story, which had begun as 8 years of cold hatred in a registered cage, did not turn into a fairy tale about, "and they lived happily ever after." It ended as a complex adult symphony with spaces of silence between the notes. Silence in which each of them could check whether he had lost himself trying to be someone's ideal partner. Silence in which they could sit side by side and know, if tomorrow it hurt again, they would not follow their old destructive path, but stop and say so out loud. For people watching from the outside, everything looked simple. The former Omega freed the Alpha for his true love, then came to his wedding, watched the ceremony fall apart, and ended up getting him back. For those living inside, it was an acknowledgement of a much more uncomfortable truth. Sometimes real love walks through hatred, fear, and wrong decisions, and only then, under the loudest possible noise, chooses silence in the presence of one specific person. If you've listened to this story all the way to the end, tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest. The 8 years of cold hatred, the signature on the refusal, the ruined wedding, or the quiet year after it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to BL Story of Love so you don't miss the next forbidden BL story. And remember, even if your story started with hatred and mistakes, it doesn't mean the final chord can't sound like honest, grown-up love.